So I've got this classical guitar here that I've just gotten done setting up, and these are some new strings. For anybody who plays nylon string, you know that these things take a long time to break in, and a lot of stretching has to be involved if these things are going to be stable. I used to call this the 2 weeks of hell whenever I change the strings on my classical, because it just sits there. Like, if you stretch out the strings on it, you know, you can do a pretty good job, but it's still going to have some movement, and a lot of movement over the course of the next week or so. And the trick that I'm going to show you isn't necessarily going to get rid of all of that, though it may help you along, and it may be a little bit easier to deal with than what you're currently dealing with. So when we change the strings on any guitar, usually what we'll do is we'll go in and we'll kind of stretch up here at the 12th fret, and we'll go in, we'll kind of do one of these numbers here, and we'll do that on all of the strings. And I kind of like to put a little bit of an angle in it sometimes, like kind of pull in this direction, then I'll pull in this direction when I'm doing that. That can sometimes help a little bit. Sometimes you'll even feel a little bit of movement. Sometimes it's visible movement, because sometimes with classical strings, nylon strings, there are these knots that you're dealing with at the tie block, and I also do a little bit of a tie at the headstock end, and sometimes there's some space in there. You know, when you tie a knot in a rope, you know, you got to yank on both ends in order to get it to tighten up. And it's the same kind of thing here. There'll just be a little bit of space in where that knot or that friction is, and then you need to kind of pull that space out of it. And if you don't do that, that's going to be incredibly frustrating, because there's going to be a lot of movement if those knots aren't tightened. So that's the first step. The second step is really just realizing that you're dealing with some very soft materials that are going to spend some time stretching out. So like these bass strings on a classical guitar are typically, you know, silk-filled metal wound strings. And silk is an incredibly strong, but it's also kind of a stretchy material. You know, if you've ever worked with the fabric, like, you know what I'm talking about. Like, if you take a silk shirt and you kind of go like this with it, you can kind of get a little bit of movement out of it, a little bit of stretch. And if you stretch it enough, like a silk shirt will end up getting all those little wavy lines in it, because it stays stretched. So it's kind of the same thing that you're trying to do here, is you're trying to get those fibers to kind of relax. And one of the ways that I'll do that specifically for classical guitars, I don't always do this for steel string guitars, but for classical guitars I find that this helps. You go to the octave, so go to that 12th fret, which is going to be right in the middle of the string, and you just go ahead and hold it. Not with a whole lot of pressure, but with enough pressure to kind of keep it from, you know, keep it tight. I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to hold that off the board. And I'm just going to hold it there for a time period. Because unlike steel strings, this is one of those situations in which, like, the more time that it's spent under tension, the more stable it's going to be. And so I'll sit here for like a count of 20, sometimes a count of 30, and I'll just do that for each of these strings, the bass strings mainly. When it comes to the treble strings, there's a cool technique that I like to use, that I use on anything with nylon strings. I'll also do this with ukuleles. Oh man, this is a cool trick for ukuleles. If there are ukulele players out in the audience, right, try this. You'll love it. But what I'll do is I'll get the strings on the treble side stretched, and these are just nylon strings. These are, you know, they're not coated with any metal. Typically, they're not coated with any windings, and I'll make sure that they're pulled taut. I'll kind of give them the same treatment that I give those bass strings, where I'll sit and I'll hold them for a little while, you know, count to 20, whatever, and kind of let it relax, because this is another situation in which the more time spent under tension, it's going to help. Here's the cool trick, though. One thing that you can do is you can take your fingers and you can rub them along the bottom of the string like this. And what you're going to feel is heat. There's going to be a lot of heat that's generated. I recommend kind of going at this pretty easy. My hands are very calloused from working in the shop all day. If you got sensitive skin, I don't know if I'd recommend this. But I would recommend sticking with your hand, because it's possible to heat up the string to the point that it breaks. And if you aren't keeping kind of an eye on the temperature, it may break. But this heat, what this is doing is it's expanding and forcing the plastic in that nylon to relax. And so that heat that you're generating is one of the best ways that I have found to stabilize these treble strings, which are always the worst when you get into changing the strings on a classical guitar. You know, this is the situation that you deal with putting new strings on a ukulele, which is just that it's just this plastic that wants to stretch and stretch and stretch and stretch. So that's those are kind of some of the tips that I have. I have one more that I'm going to hand you all, which is that if you are just going to be kind of walking away from the instrument for the night, like you've gotten done stringing it up and you know, it's probably not going to be the best player after you get it done strung up, because even with these techniques, it's probably still going to take a little time for these strings to break in. So if you get it strung up and you walk away from it, and I recommend kind of changing classical guitar strings as you're getting ready to wind down for the night anyway, because like I said, it's probably not going to be very, very pleasant to play for at least that first night. String it up and then tune it sharp. Tune all of the strings on it sharp by at least a half step, maybe a little more if you feel like it. Don't go crazy with it. Don't get to the point that you're like pulling the bridge off the guitar. We're talking like, you know, a half step, maybe a little more than a half step. I wouldn't recommend going any higher than that, but if you tune everything to the point that it's all sharp, it's going to have more tension on it. And when you leave it alone for the rest of the night and, you know, for the hours that you're going to be sleeping, those strings are going to be stretching themselves out and getting into a point where they're more comfortable. And what I have found is that if I go through this whole process, I'm still going to have some stretching. So it's still going to kind of be a little iffy that first week. But I have taken what I used to call the 2 weeks of hell and turned it into more like, I don't know, the 3 days of mild irritation. Because actually, like, going through all of these steps does a pretty good job at getting those strings to move the way that you want them to move when you first get them on the guitar, and to stabilize the tuning. There are some string wrapping techniques when you're actually like wrapping them to kind of keep the headstock a little bit more aligned. When I wind these two E strings, I'll take the windings and I'll push them in this direction to the outside of the headstock, and for the rest of the strings I'll kind of push them to the inside of the headstock, if that makes any sense. You can kind of see what I'm talking about here. This string here comes off this side and the string here comes off this side. That can kind of help with string alignment at the nut, which will also help with tuning stability. And of course, you always want to make sure that everything is really secure at that tie block, because if you don't have this stuff secured down here, you're going to have that situation where those knots pull and they pull out. In the case of something that's super loose down here, loose enough to pull itself like literally out of the knot that you have it in and, you know, come out entirely. The problem that can tend to cause is that these things will whip through those little holes and they'll end up dinging the top of the guitar. And so be sure that you're wrapping your tie block tightly. I always use 3 winds, and I always, this is the important part, always make sure that one of those twists goes over the back corner, goes over this corner here, so that that corner can provide the friction against those twists so they don't pull out. So those are the tips that I had to talk about today. If anyone has any cool ones that they'd like to add, put those down in the comments. I may end up adopting them myself. I have a link down there to my Ko-Fi and to my Patreon, and if you found this video helpful and you want to kick me a few bucks, it definitely helps me out. There's also a link down there to my Reverb page where I sell some instruments, used instruments, vintage instruments that I've gone through real thoroughly. There's also a link down there to my website where you can find my pricing and my contact page, as well as a guide that I wrote for caring for stringed instruments. Just been adding this to the kind of my more recent videos, but if anybody has any long form questions, that's to say you have a question that's more than like, 2 or 3 sentences tops, like I really do prefer to get those through Ko-Fi. just because it takes me a lot of time to answer those in some cases, and I kind of like to get paid for my work. But I try to help people out as much as I possibly can. So I get around to these comments eventually, and I will absolutely answer anything that is submitted through Ko-fi or Patreon. Anything else, I'll try to get to it. This has been Drew Jones of Drew's Guitar Shop in Seattle, Washington. Thanks for watching.